Hello everyone, welcome to Dynamics. I hope you're all doing well. We will have a very brief introduction to dynamics in this particular concept talk. Okay, so introduction to dynamics. And in this small talk, we will look at certain questions. These are the questions or the topics that I would like to discuss. What is dynamics? What are the branches of dynamics? Then we would also like to look at the overall structure of this course. Then we will look at, very briefly the relevance of dynamics, the different types of problems that, dynamics enables us to solve. So the relevance of dynamics. And then lastly, we will look at certain basic concepts that you might have perhaps come across in statics or mechanics of materials as well. Okay, so we should look at some basic concepts. All right, so let's start with the question, what is dynamics? Okay. And this is a question I'm sure that perhaps you might have encountered and also had an answer when you were studying perhaps introductory classes in statics and mechanics. There would have been a mention of the word dynamics on there. Okay, but dynamics essentially is a branch of mechanics. So dynamics is a branch of mechanics. Which leads us to the question, what is mechanics? And the answer is that in mechanics, we study forces acting on bodies. In mechanics, we study forces acting on bodies. These bodies themselves could be fluid bodies or they could be solid bodies. And if the body is a fluid, then you could call the study of the forces as fluid mechanics. Otherwise, it's called as solid mechanics. So you have a bifurcation of mechanics itself into solid mechanics and fluid mechanics. And then fluid mechanics. And in solid mechanics, you can further split it into rigid body mechanics and deformable body mechanics. I'm not going to go through the semantics of these, but we will particularly constrain ourselves to rigid body mechanics. Okay, so our constraint, we will limit ourselves. Limit ourselves to the study of rigid body and particle mechanics. And the terms rigid body and the term particle are things that you have already encountered in statics and mechanics of materials. Typically, rigid body does not deform substantially when forces are applied on it, and particles are things that have only a mass but do not have a geometric dimension. Okay, so rigid bodies they do not show a large change in size and shape when forces act on it. So do not show large changes in size and shape when forces act on them or when loaded by external forces. And the idea of particles is that these are essentially rigid bodies but without any geometric dimension to them. Okay, so particles, they do not possess any geometry, but have a finite mass. Right, and I want to underline these things here. So, rigid bodies is something that we will be looking at very carefully in this course, and also about particles. And so, what is dynamics then? So, dynamics is a branch of mechanics. In dynamics, we study forces acting on bodies that are under motion. So, these bodies are not necessarily in static equilibrium, and this is because of the forces themselves being non-equilibrated, okay, which means that they are unequal, and this enables the body to move in a certain direction where the largest force makes it want to move. Okay, so in dynamics, I'm sorry, so in dynamics we study the motion of bodies under the action of non-equilibrated forces. Okay, that's a key word there, which essentially tells us that, okay, we are not solving statics problems anymore, though that would be a really nice thing to do because statics is fairly straightforward, right? But dynamics has its own beauty, I think. Okay. All right. There are two branches of dynamics, which, depending on the person that you talk to, they either like to say it that way or not. But for us, dynamics can be broadly split into kinematics and kinetics. Okay, so dynamics can be split into kinematics. Will be split into kinematics and then kinetics. And what do we do in kinematics? In kinematics, we study the motion of bodies without worrying about the forces that cause them. Okay, so in kinematics, we study motion without worrying about the forces that cause this particular motion. So from that perspective, kinematics can be thought of as a purely geometric thing. Okay, so this is almost like a geometric perspective of motion. Geometry of motion. And in kinetics, we look at, okay, what are the forces acting on the body, and why is the body moving the way it is moving. Okay, so in kinetics, we look at the motion of bodies and the forces acting on it. Okay, so look at the motion due to the forces acting on the body. And essentially kinetics tries to answer, what force should you apply to a body to produce a prescribed motion. Okay, so essentially if you want to write it here, so what force to apply to cause a certain motion. Okay, so this is the question that kinetics will try to answer. Okay, so we come to the structure of our course. The overall structure of our course is as follows. Okay, so structure of the course. We can divide this course into four parts. In the first part, we will be looking at the kinematics of particles. Then we will be looking at the kinetics of particles. And then we look at the kinematics of rigid bodies. And then lastly, we look at the kinetics of rigid bodies. Okay, so part one is the kinematics of particles. Then we shall look at the the kinetics of particles. The order of these things is, dependent on the instructor. Some people like to study all the kinematics first and then go into the kinetics. But I typically like to go from particles onto rigid bodies. Okay, so we look at the kinetics of particles. Then we shall look at the kinematics of rigid bodies. And then lastly, we shall look at the kinetics of rigid bodies. And as we look at the kinetics of rigid bodies, we will be particularly interested in vibratory motion of bodies. Okay, so we shall also have a particular importance on mechanical vibrations. Okay, and also mechanical vibrations. Okay, kinematics of particles and kinematics of rigid bodies will be very useful to you when you look at your course on kinematics. And then kinetics of rigid bodies, especially the mechanical vibrations part, will be very useful for your system dynamics course. Okay, so this is going to be the structure of our course here. Okay, and to cap it off, we want to look at the relevance of dynamics. Okay, so the relevance of dynamics. Okay, this essentially answers the question, why are we interested in dynamics? And the reason is quite obvious. We see motion all around us. We are curious people. We would like to model, or we would like to understand how this motion takes place, right? And that is precisely the reason why we have to study dynamics. Okay, so curiosity about the motion around us enables us to study dynamics by talking about the motion from a mathematical perspective. Okay, so curiosity, yes, I'm going to change my colors back. Curiosity about the motion of bodies around us is one reason why we need to study dynamics. So whenever we need to quantify motion of bodies, we need dynamics. Okay, so enables us to, so dynamics enables us to quantify such motion. Right? And the nice thing about dynamics is that it will quantify motion in a mathematical form or a mathematical framework, which we can then make use of certain mathematical tools to understand things better. Okay, so in dynamics eventually will provide a mathematical framework to understand motion. And this can be used in several fields. You could be interested in path planning of robots, how to overcome obstacles, maybe drug delivery systems, and so on. You could be interested in vibrations of structures. Why is this bridge collapsing? What are the factors that are involved in the propagation of waves in solids? Perhaps you're interested in the motion of cells and flow of blood. Dynamics is involved there. You're interested in harmonic analysis of oscillators. You're interested in the design of projectiles. Dynamics is involved there. You're interested in biomechanics. Dynamics is involved there. Okay, so this is having a vast amount of usage, especially in fields of robotics, biomechanics, structural vibration, okay, or structural engineering. You can employ the principles of dynamics in cell biology if you want, etc. And for me, the most fascinating aspect of dynamics is the application of dynamics to study human motion. Okay, and this is something that we will talk about in terms of the problems that we will be looking at later down the course. All right, so very briefly complete the lecture. I want to just list a few of the basic concepts. I'm not going to go over the details of these things because these are fairly straightforward and obvious to you, and you might have come across them. But in terms of the basic concepts that we will be looking at in this course, we will be looking at mass. Usually the units will be in kilograms. I'm going to mostly follow the SI system. Once in a while, we will look at the foot-pound second system, and then I'll be very particular about it when I do problems on that. Okay, then we will be looking at quantities of length. The units will be meters or millimeters, inches, feet, depending on what units we follow, what system of units we follow. Then we look at time. Time is of great consequence to dynamics. Unfortunately, that is the case because we don't have much time, but we still have to deal with time. Okay, that was a pretty bad joke that I usually plant on my class when we meet live. Time is measured in seconds. And then we have the quantities of force, which is the contact of one body on another, or it could be through action from a distance, right, in the form of gravity forces and so on. Force will be having the units of newtons, named after Isaac Newton. And typically when you read about forces, you will also have the associated quantities such as couple moments, which will have units of Newton meters. And something that I'll be posting on my elaborate lecture notes is Newton's laws of motion, and this is the central tenet that enables us to quantify motion from a mathematical perspective. Okay, and Newton's laws of motion. Particularly the second law, where we say that force is proportional to the rate of change of momentum, or force is mass times the acceleration vector. Okay, this is the second law. And we will see that the second law has to be modified to account for rigid bodies and so on. All right, thank you very much. I'll see you in the next concept talk. Bye-bye.